I'm sorry it's hot. Yeah, just the women. I was hoping I might be able to begin tonight by saying, you know, there's a hint of fall in the air. You can just sense it, but no. We lack a little getting to the fall. Here are some of the things that we have learned over the last year about John. How many are new? How many have not been in our John class? Admit it. Okay. 3 or 4 or 5, and everybody else will probably appreciate us going back over some of the things to remind ourselves about. You see, it's only as we understand the first 12 chapters that 13 through 21, 9 chapters, really are going to make the most sense. So, talking about John as a gospel, just briefly. John was probably written last and maybe a couple of decades or more after the synoptic gospels. You know the synoptics, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Called synoptic because they see Jesus kind of from the same perspective. John doesn't. He's a maverick. His gospel is really different. And one of the things I mentioned to you, and I hope you'll remember this, John writes with the simplest Greek language that you can imagine. I mentioned that I minored in Greek in college, and when we started reading the New Testament, guess what we started reading? John. Because it's the Greek equivalent of see Dick Chase Spock. You know, it's like that. The words are simple words, and the vocabulary is usually quite simple. Say in contrast to Dr. Luke's gospel, which has a lot of difficult technical language in it. John's not like that at all. His is simple and free-flowing, but the theological concepts that he deals with are as deep as you will find anywhere in the New Testament. That's not just my opinion. It's the opinion of nearly everyone who has ever studied the Gospel of John. And I hope you felt some of that. Also, John is unique in the sense of that it includes a bunch of things that are not found in the synoptics, and it leaves out or excludes many of the things that you might expect to be in a gospel. Would anybody like to find a gold star by telling me some of the things that John includes that are not in the synoptics? When I get home, Paula's going to say, why didn't you tell me ahead of time? I could have looked that up.
You've got my Bible. I can't look it up.
And now she's blaming it on the fact that I have her Bible. Yes. Anybody, do you remember anything that we found in John that I said, you won't find that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke?
Water into wine?
I'm sorry?
Water into wine?
Water into wine is definitely one of them. Did you look after all? Okay.
No, I did not.
Good for you. In fact, 6 out of the 8 miracles that we find in John are not found in the synoptics, so something else. You remember a fellow named Nicodemus that Jesus visited with at night? You wouldn't know about him if it weren't for John. Anything else going? The woman at the well. Do you remember the woman at the well?
Yeah.
She's the one that said, you know, our forefather says that we should worship in this mountain, and you say in Jerusalem. Who's got it right? That's the woman at the well. John's the only one that tells you about that. Now, what I found most intriguing is why, or the things that John did not include in his gospel, which are a very main focus in some of the other gospels. You want to take a shot at that? Why is John different from others in what he doesn't record? The birth of Jesus. You find it in Matthew, you find it in Luke. Mark got busy. He said, this is what happened when Jesus was 30. John doesn't mention it. He goes back to the other side of the birth, but he doesn't mention the birth. He doesn't include a genealogy like you find in Matthew and Luke. Some of the things that I found interesting is, the temptations of Jesus, cast yourself down, the angels will bear you. None of those temptations are in John. The Transfiguration, which is one of my favorite events in the Gospels, John doesn't say anything about it. There's no list of the apostles. And I think the thing that I found most intriguing about what John does not include, there's not a single parable in John. When you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you'd think that's all Jesus said. As a matter of fact, Mark even notes that when Jesus spoke to the crowds, he always spoke in parables. But wait, you don't find very much of Jesus speaking to the crowds at all in John. In John, you have a lot more personal conversations. The woman at the well, and Nicodemus, and the person who was born blind. They're individual conversations, and not one single parable in the entire gospel. But I know you knew that, but that's just a reminder. Okay? All right. And in your notes, I said it's almost as though the Gospel of John is made up of two books. Chapters 1 through 12, some have called the book of signs. And in the notes, I have listed the 7 signs that John includes. As Paula mentioned, he turns water to wine at Cana. He heals a royal official's son, and he's not even in the same town with him when he does it. You remember that? He tells the royal official, go home, your boy's okay. And he was. The paralytic at the pool called Bethesda. He'd been there for decades. But Jesus healed him, told him to take up his mat and go on his way. Feeding 5,000 plus people with a boy's lunch. It's almost, is that the ice maker? I'm glad it is. It's almost like the circus clown car where they keep coming out of the Volkswagen. I don't know how he does that, but he takes up 12 basketfuls after he's finished with feeding this giant crowd. And then when the apostles are on their way back home, Jesus takes a shortcut across the lake. I've tried that, but I forgot where the stones were and just went straight down. Walking across the lake on the water. And then in John chapter 9, what a stir, the man who was born blind. Jesus healed him so he could see. For the very first time in his life, he could see. And then he brought Lazarus back to life in chapter 11. A man who'd been in the grave for 4 days. The family was so upset that Jesus would ask for the stone to be rolled away. There's going to be a stench. This is embarrassing. But life came out of that tomb. These were the signs that John records. Keep that in mind when you remember what John's purpose was. I know you remember this, right? Is this the same class that... In John chapter 20, he waits till the end to tell you why he's writing. But at least he tells you why he's writing this gospel. In chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, John says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs. Not just the 7 that I've recorded. He did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. Well, then why did you include these 7? Glad you asked, John says. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. John's admitting there's a lot of miracles that I could have included, but I chose these. And I chose them to show you the kind of person Jesus was with the hopes of bringing you to faith. And that's not the end all, is it? What would be the result of their faith? They would have life in his name. John wants people, not only in the first century, but even people like us, to enjoy real life, because we have come to believe that this Jesus that he's writing about is indeed the Christ, the Son of the living God. I've wrestled all day with doing whether I was going to do this or not, and I'm going to give it a shot. I suggested to you that the prologue of John's Gospel is so deep and profound and meaningful that you would be blessed to try to learn it by heart. Does anybody remember that?
Yes.
Do you remember how many times you tried before you gave up? I'm going to try. Yes, by the way, and if you're not familiar with the Gospel, John begins by referring to Jesus as the Logos, which is translated word. He's called the Logos, the life principle. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it, or the darkness has not overcome it. There came a man sent from God. His name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning this light. He himself, so that all men might believe through him. He himself was not the light. He only came to witness to the light. The true light that gives light to all men was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet, to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and lived for a while among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." From his goodness we have all received one blessing after another. One moment. For the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the only Son, who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. Now, I want you to know that just learning that and saying those words to myself over and over again have been very helpful to me personally. To remember that there was a time when the man who underwent the most horrific death imaginable was one time like this with God and said, "Okay, if they need it, I'm gone. If they need it, I'll be there for them. I'll do what they need, even at that kind of a cost." Now, the miracles that are listed, not surprisingly, even though John wrote these miracles, recorded these miracles so that people could believe, he mentions during the gospel that some people who saw these miracles did exactly that. They went, wow, no one can do that kind of thing unless, he's from God. But not everybody. John also points out that there was some serious unbelief that went along with the believing people. And ironically, sometimes the unbelief was because they saw Jesus as a rule breaker or a law breaker. You remember which law specifically that they thought he broke? The Sabbath law. The guy I told you who had been crippled for decades sitting by the pool, Jesus sent him home carrying his mat. And the religious leader said, "What are you doing carrying your mat on the Sabbath?" And he said, "Well, I hadn't planned to, but I've been crippled for 20 years plus, and I was just going home with this." And they said, but you don't, it's the Sabbath. See, they didn't hear, "I've been crippled for decades and am now healed." All they heard was, "It's the Sabbath." The same thing for the man who was born blind in John chapter 9. He had never, ever in his life seen. The religious authorities went to the parents and they said, "Are you sure this guy is your son and he's never been able to see?" Yeah. We don't know much about what happened, but he's our boy. And they said, "Well, that's all well and good, but I mean, how many days are there in the week? Why does he have to get well on the Sabbath?" The fact that somebody had been given sight who had never seen couldn't make a dent in their psyche. Only the fact that it was done on the Sabbath. And so with each miracle, you can see the tension growing between Jesus and the religious leaders. You know something bad is going to happen. But of course you know, because you've read the book. The disciples don't know. They know that they wish Jesus didn't do this kind of thing, but he did. And then the one miracle that really put them over the edge. Do you remember which one that was? The last in the list? The raising of Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus had been in the grave for 4 days. Jesus raised him from the dead, and that seemed to do it for the religious leaders. I think I was going to read to you, but I can't find the passage that I wrote down in my notes. Paula, you're going to have to do better with these notes because I'm having trouble finding it. It's either in the end of chapter 11 or in chapter 12. It doesn't matter. Is it at the end of 11?
Yeah.
The religious leaders, basically, I'm going to paraphrase, get together and say, "You know what? It's not just Jesus now. Even Lazarus, people who find Lazarus and that Lazarus had been dead, the whole world's going after Jesus." And from that time, John says, they determined to put him to death. Now, I'm sure that there had been some talk about it, but now we've got to put a plan in place. This man has to go or our nation is going to be destroyed. The Romans are going to come in here and just say, "We've had enough of this." So we've got to get rid of Jesus. And that starts at the end, really, of chapter 12. And I want to mention one other thing, and then we're about ready to go on with chapter 13. The other thing that Jesus did and said, mostly said, that caused such great animosity with the religious leaders was just 2 words. You remember what they? Yeah, you do.
I am.
Who'd have thunk that those 2 little words could get somebody in such trouble? And I showed you kind of what it looks like in Greek. Ego, eimi. Just in case you're required to know this to go to heaven, I thought it'd be important for me to point it out to you. I'd hate for you to say, he could have mentioned it. Ego, eimi, in the Greek, And the best sign of it is in chapter 8. If you dared to bring a Bible, in chapter 8, beginning at verse 56, they've been talking about Abraham. The religious leaders say, you know, we're children of Abraham. And Jesus says, well, then act like it. Act like you're children of Abraham. And then he says this, beginning in verse 56. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day. He saw it and was glad. Well, you're not 50 years old, the Jews said to him, and you've seen Abraham? I tell you the truth, before Abraham was born, I am. Or some translation, before Abraham was, I am. Well, you say, well, it's an outlandish claim that he was living before Abraham, but what's the big deal? Who'd like to tell me what the big deal is about I am?
That's what God
Yeah.
said.
You remember what Moses was commissioned to go to Egypt? He saw the burning bush, and as God commissioned him, you're going to Egypt, and he said, I don't even know who you are. Who shall I say sent me? And the voice said, I am who I am. You tell the people in Egypt, I am has sent you. What's your name? I am is my name. And in Hebrew, as many of you know, the four Hebrew letters that are transliterated into English is Yahweh. And that word took on such notoriety. This is the Hebrew one now, equivalent to this in Greek. This took on such notoriety that when people came to it, reading in the synagogue, when they came to that name, they changed it. They wouldn't even read Yahweh. They substituted Adonai, which means the Lord. Why? Well, who has a right to pronounce that name? Jesus said, I do. See, and that was the problem. A name that they had come to hold in the highest possible regard, Jesus claimed for himself. Before Abraham was, ego eimi. And that's why John is known for the famous 7 I am statements in the gospel. They're here in your notes if you have notes, but I'll bet you know most of them anyway. I am the bread of life. I am the good shepherd. I am the resurrection and the life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So, you know, if someone says to you, I was thinking of a passage the other day, I am the good shepherd, but do you have any idea where that is? You say, well, I'm pretty sure it's in John. Well, of course it is. Just like all of the other I am statements are in John. 7 of them that John records. And that as much as anything. Yes, he was a Sabbath breaker. He had no respect for the law. But to dare to say, I am, was really what put them over the edge. Any questions on all of that? Oh, it's only 7:30. I'm sure we're getting out early. See, I allowed 30 minutes for questions. That's you know that's not true. You know that's not true. I did not do that. So with the end of chapter 12, the public ministry of Jesus in John's gospel essentially comes to an end. You are not going to hear him out talking to strangers and multitudes or, even personal conversations. But the only kind of conversations Jesus will have from now on that are not with his disciples are with people like Pontius Pilate. When he says a few things to him during the trial. But as far as trying to reach out to the crowd, Jesus is not doing that anymore. What he is doing is focusing on the 12 and trying to get them ready for his departure. He knows he is not going to be around much longer. And he is going to be leaving it in the hands of these 12 men that he has chosen. And so 13:1 says, it was just before the Passover feast, and Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. There are a number of times, I listed 2 of them here for you in the notes. Chapter 7, verse 30. Where concerning the authorities, it says at this time they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him. Do you remember why? Because his hour had not yet come. And in chapter 8 also, verse 20, he spoke these words while teaching in the temple near the place where the offerings were put. Yet no one seized him because his hour. Sometimes it's translated time, but the Greek word is hour. His hour had not yet come. John 13 opens and says Jesus knows that his hour has come. Now, I don't want to be too graphic. I don't think I will, but if you know that within 12 hours you're going to be nailed to a giant piece of wood and left to die, would that get your attention? Oh yeah, but it's Jesus. Yes, but the Word became flesh. He experienced what you and I would experience, knowing that lay ahead for us as well. And so now he thinks, okay, I've only got a few hours. And it's right before the Passover. I'm going to sit down with my guys, and we're going to eat a meal together. And hopefully, in this meal, we'll share some things. They'll strengthen me. I'll be able to convey information that's very important to them, all because he knows that his hour has now come. He doesn't have any time left over. And fittingly, it is the Passover meal. A reminder of the Passover lamb and the blood on the doorposts. John the Baptist had said earlier, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And in the last 12 hours of his life, there is the eating of the Passover lamb. That what Jesus will certainly understand in this case applies to him. But Jesus knows more than the fact that his hour has come. Notice verse 3. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and that he was returning to God. Jesus knows his identity. He knows where he originated, and he knows where he's going to. And you think, well, that takes all of the... No, it doesn't. I'm pretty confident of where I'm going to, but if you want to put me on a piece of wood nailed there, I'm going to be upset. And so we read Jesus saying, my heart is troubled. My heart is anxious because of what is about to come. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the 12. And just set Judas aside for a minute, because I'm going to talk about Judas next week. Okay? So I'm just going to say, he had invested himself in the 12, and the 12 were believers. They had come to put their trust in Jesus. You remember when Peter was asked, are you too going to go away? What he said? Where are you going to go? You have the words of eternal life, Peter said. A true believer. But just because they were believers does not mean that they got it. It's so important that we understand that. You know, we tend to glorify their apostles. Yes, they evolved into courageous missionaries for Jesus Christ. But during the time that Jesus was with them, that does not describe who they are. In many ways, they're dolts. They don't get stuff. In fact, they had one of the most important things involved in being a follower of Jesus all wrong. You know that? Well, I don't mean that they forgot how many tribes there were. No, I'm talking about an essential value of the Christian life had totally escaped them. Their idea of the Messiah had nothing to do with the cross. Do you remember how often Jesus said the Son of Man is going to Jerusalem and being delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified and raised again on the third day? Do you know how many times in the Gospels he told them that? Several. Did they get it? No. No, they kind of, he talks funny, you know. Don't pay any attention to that. And the thing that I think probably upset Jesus the most was the way they jockeyed for position in the kingdom. Now, John gave me permission to do this. I'm going to read from another gospel. He said it wasn't as good as his, but he said I could read from it. This is one of my favorite passages because it presents the apostles as being almost like kids. Like kids. Mark 9, beginning at verse 33. They came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, now picture this, he asked them, I'm paraphrasing, but by the way, what were you guys arguing about on the road? What were you arguing about? And notice the response. I can find it in a minute. But they kept quiet because on the way they had argued about who was the greatest. They'd never met Muhammad Ali. They didn't know that had been settled. They argued about who was the greatest. And now, question. When Jesus asked them what they were arguing about, and they didn't want to tell him, why?
They were embarrassed.
Why were they embarrassed? Because Jesus had told them, don't talk about stuff like that. That's nuts. Don't focus on that kind of stuff. That's not what we're about. And I'll just mention Luke's gospel, who John said was almost as good as his. In Luke 22 and verse 24, it says that on this occasion, when they were in the upper room, about to eat the Passover meal, they were discussing greatness and who was top dog among them. Now, if Jesus is looking for a time of intimacy at a meal when he could be strengthened for what was going to happen, wouldn't you think he'd want to know that the apostles had got this principle? But clearly, they had not. So, Jesus decided to demonstrate what he had been verbally emphasizing throughout his ministry. Now, you're familiar with Near Eastern customs. You've heard sermons on this kind of thing. When people went to somebody's house for a meal, you know, they traveled in those sandals. Bunch of hippies. I mean, I don't know. They're traveling in these sandals, and the dirt and this grime gets on their feet. You know, they're basically clean. Maybe they bathed that day, maybe they didn't, but their feet are dirty. So when you attend a meal and you walk the streets to get there, by the door there is always a basin, a water pitcher, and a towel, right? Now, just to throw this out, I don't know the answer. I know they've eaten a bunch together before. Did they have a servant who washed their feet? I don't know. Did they take turns washing feet? I don't know. But here's what I know. They had talked even that evening about who was going to be the greatest, and when they began to walk in and saw the pitcher and the basin and the towel, they said, "Not me. I ain't washing feet." Their grammar was quite bad in the first century. And so apparently they get up to the table, and we're going to talk about how you eat at a table. You've heard it before, but we have to discuss it because it fits into the story. And I think Jesus kind of, I'm going above and beyond, Paula. Paula said I could. I can see Jesus looking around, looking at the basin, looking around. Okay. And the way John tells this, it's really classic. Most of the stories that he tells in the past tense. But when he tells this one, the first part of it is in the present tense. You understand what that would sound like? So instead of Jesus got up, Jesus gets up, takes off his robe, wraps himself in a towel, and pours water into the basin. And then began, past tense, to go around and wash the disciples' feet. I wish John had given a little fuller account of this. I really do. I guess we don't need it because it's not there. But I don't know how many feet he had washed it, but I get the impression that every time he went to one of the 12 and washed their feet, they sat there in they reclined there in stunned silence at the thought of their Lord washing their feet. You know who normally washed the feet, right? It was the lowest slave in the household. Once you graduated from the foot washing level, you praised the Lord. But until then, the lowest of low was who washed the stinking feet of people. And now Jesus is doing it. And they're like, until, of course, he gets to who? Peter. You know, it's amazing. Peter had something to say. Peter always has something to say. And it's interesting. I wish I could give you a direct translation from the Greek because it's quite interesting how he says it. You, me, feet? No. No. You're not washing my feet. And Jesus says, I think, I'm paraphrasing, I think you better rethink that, Peter. A couple of things. You don't understand right now what I'm doing. You don't understand. But you will. And secondly, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part with me. You have no part with me. That's a crucial principle in the story of washing feet. Let me go back there to John 13, verses 7 and 8. You do not realize what I'm doing, but later you will understand. No, said Peter, you'll never wash my feet. Unless I wash you, you will have no part with me. Wow, I didn't know getting your feet washed was that crucial. What is crucial, Jesus says, is unless you let me do for you what you cannot do for you, you're out of luck. And I think I think when he says, you don't understand what I'm doing now, you will later. I'm not sure when that hit Peter. But I'm fully persuaded that what Jesus is doing in washing the feet has its supreme demonstration in a few hours when he is hanging on the cross on their behalf. He is doing something for them in the upper room that they can't understand what they need, and he will be doing something at Calvary which they cannot understand but desperately need. You know that passage in Philippians 2? Your attitude should be like that of Jesus Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant and being made in human likeness. Now, okay, he took the nature of a servant, but look what Paul says next. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. There are lots of reasons, I'm sure, in this world for why people do not want to be followers of Jesus. But I can tell you from personal experience, from having talked to people, one of them is they don't like the idea of having to depend on someone else. Y'all know who Marty Robbins is? Y'all know that song, My Woman, My Woman, My Wife. He loves this woman whose life has been very, very difficult. And he prays to God and he says, give her my share of heaven if I've earned any here, if I've earned any here in this life. For God, I believe she deserves it. I love the song, but the theology stinks. Give her my share of heaven? Excuse me, and how did you get that share? You don't give it away, you are given it. Peter is such an independent guy. It's hard for him to accept things. And when he thinks about the guy who said, you have the words of eternal life and now you're going to wash my feet, I am not going to allow that. You better, Peter. You better. Even if you don't understand, you will. The second thing, lowly service, is embodied in the cross. The second thing, there is nothing that is more essential to the Christian way than lowly service. There is nothing that is more essential to the Christian way than lowly service. That even goes beyond having the right political beliefs. It's the kind of thing that Jesus tried so hard to get across. But it's not just first century people who struggle with that. It's people that live in our day as well. Since I mentioned Mark and I mentioned Luke, I'll read from Matthew. I think it's in your notes. It is. It's Matthew 20. Matthew 20. Yeah, it'd be good if I got in the right chapter. I told Paula to mark it and she didn't. You probably know that one time James and John came to Jesus seeking preeminence in the kingdom, and apparently it didn't work, so guess what they did? They sent Mom. Matthew 20, beginning at verse 20, says, then the mother of Zebedee's sons, that's James and who? John! This John
The mother of the sons of Zebedee came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. I want you to do me a favor. Well, what is it you want? He said. Grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom.
Gee, Mom, we didn't know you were going to ask that.
Of course, when they didn't get Jesus to do it for them, they brought in Mom. And then skipping down to verse 24. And you can understand this. When the 10 that weren't James and John heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. Jesus called them together and said, you know, listen up, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Now, please understand that when a Jew mentions Gentiles, it's not complimentary. You know that the rulers of the Jews lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. That's how Gentiles do it. Not so with you. And I wish you could read that in the Greek. It can't be that way with you. We can't have that in the kingdom, is what the Lord is saying. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first among you must be your slave. Had he mentioned that? Yes. And then here's the reason. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So when you see him with the towel and the basin in the upper room, it is the personification of who Jesus came to be, which was deepened hours later when he surrendered himself to be crucified. Now, I'll just make a quick point about this. I served in a few churches in my life. And I'd have to say, if pressed, that their style of leadership was much more Gentile than it was like this. I'm in charge, so you do this. And if you don't like it tough, I'm in charge. Would you believe that a church leader would act like that?
Yes.
Did someone say most? I thought I heard most. Jesus said, listen to this, that's what Gentiles do. Don't you be like that. It can't be that way with you. If you want to be first, if you want to have priority, then get in there at the bottom level and serve. Just like I did, he said. Just as the Son of Man came to do that. That's what you need to do. And I worry that I'm not nearly as good at that as I should be. I can't practice as good as I can teach. But anybody who can't teach worth a lick. You better be able to out-teach your anyway. It isn't easy. And we can look back at the 12 and think, how thick were they? When Jesus talked about this so much, they get to the upper room, his heart is breaking, and they're going, I'm greater than you are. Really? But I know that that kind of thing still goes on. I want to get to one more thing before the applications. It's in verse 17. Oh, I'm in Matthew. Someone read verse 17 to me. of chapter 13.
Know these things.
Now that you know these things, what?
Happy.
You will be blessed if you what? Do them. You see, it's not enough just to know you're supposed to be this way. The blessing Jesus assures them and us comes in the practice of it. Hard or not, it comes in the practice of it. Some of you probably know this. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, could you find the Sermon on the Mount if you had to? It's in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Okay? And the last thing that is recorded in the Sermon on the Mount is this. Oh, tell me you sang that song. The wise man built his house upon the rock. You see, that's the last thing that Jesus says. And sometimes we hear that and we think, okay, you can either build your house on evil principles or good principles. If you build your house on evil principles, your house will fall. If you build it on good principles, your house will stand. And that's not what it says. What it says is this. He who hears these words of mine and does them is like the man who built his house upon the rock. He who hears these words, maybe he believes them, but does not do them is what? The guy who built his house on the sand. It's not a matter of different principles. It's a matter of whether you do what you know to be right or not. Or just know it. And I can almost see their faces as Jesus said, okay, you know these things now? You know? Then you better do it. Because any blessing that you find will come not in the knowledge of being a servant, but in the practice of being a servant. I don't know the best way to practice servant leadership in the context of the church. I just know that we need desperately to improve. Several churches that I was involved with, the leaders gathered behind closed doors in a boardroom and then came out and gave their edicts. This is what everybody's going to do. There's got to be a better way. I think Jesus would tell us there's got to be a better way. Okay, as we close at 7:59, just real quick, some practical applications. My wife says, if you're not going to make applications, why are you teaching? Humility is not something we draw attention to. Jesus doesn't stand up and say, okay guys, I'm going to humble myself and give you a lesson in humility. He simply gets up and grabs the pan and the water and the basin and washes stinky feet. He just did it. Let me just tell you a quick story. And you may not see the relevance of this story, but maybe at 3 o'clock in the morning you wake up, oh, now I think I see. It was while I was preaching in a fairly large church, and we were having some kind of fellowship, and there was a lady there with a baby who decided that lunch had not agreed. You with me? Whoa, projectile onto the carpet. I ran as fast as I could to the kitchen. I grabbed a wad of paper towels, and I came back there and started, trying to sop it up. And people stood there and go, why are you doing that? I don't want you to misunderstand the story. Here's what I'm trying to say. Why am I projecting
a picture of me that doesn't fit with mopping up vomit. I mean, what? You understand? Why can't people see me doing that? And I'm telling you, it made me think. What am I projecting? If anybody else had run and done it, would that have been all right? But why not me? I'm not saying, oh boy, look at what I'm saying, why were people so shocked by that? It made me very sad. In Matthew 23, another gospel, Jesus talks about the Pharisees. And what he says essentially is, when they practice religion, the primary reason why they do it is for people to see it. They wear garments that scream, I'm righteous, just from the garment that they wear. When they give money, they make noise so that everyone will notice. Jesus says that's not the kind of Christian life that I'm calling people to. It's the lowly service. It's not something that we draw attention to. Number 2, humility is being willing to receive service without embarrassment. See, Peter, if you'd interviewed Peter, he'd probably said, well, I just felt too humble for the Lord to wash my feet. Really, Peter? It was humility? Was that really the issue? Sometimes it's difficult for us to have people serve us. Do you know who's really bad at that?
I didn't see that.
Okay, good. Paul is the kind of person, you say, well, I'm going to bring you a meal. Oh, okay, I'll bring you 5. She can't stand it. Something in her childhood, I don't know. But I remember one time early on in my preaching, and I was talking to a fellow who had been preaching about 8 years longer than I have, and I was telling him about a situation where someone was doing this and this, and I just felt, and he said to me, now listen, Don, you know that half of fellowship is receiving. If you can't be a gracious receiver, then you are cheating people out of the opportunity of giving. And I went like this. Because I had no answer for that. And I think humility is not only in what you're willing to do, but humility is what you're able to have people do for you and not be too big for your britches, Paula. I mean, I cut that out of the tape. Thirdly, humility is not a sign of weakness. Well, if I'm going to be humble, I guess I'll just be downtrodden. Well, you might get trodden on a little bit, but humility is essentially a recognition of who we are and who we've been called to emulate. Because at the end of this foot washing, Jesus said, since I, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, therefore you ought to wash my feet? No, what? One another's feet. See, people would line up to wash Jesus' feet. I just don't know about yours. In other words, Jesus says, in your dealings with one another, don't think who can be in prime position. Think about who can serve. What can you do for other people? What can you do to help your fellow apostle be a better guy? It's not a sign of weakness. It's a recognition of who we're called to be. And sometimes that takes a lot of strength. And finally, humility does not discriminate. See, I told you I'm going to talk about Judas next week, but what I'll say about him this week is that I believe Jesus washed everybody's feet. Not only did he not skip Judas, but he washed his feet in such a way that it didn't look any different from everybody else's feet. Because at the end of the meal, did the disciples know who the betrayer was? No. Well, truth be told, if I'd have washed Judas's feet, I think everybody would have known. Sometimes we only want to be servants to people that we like and who say nice things about us. So many times Jesus said, you know, if you're going to be different, if you're going to be followers of mine and have a unique lifestyle, then you know, you can't just love those who love you. And Judas deserved, well, what he got was a master who washed his feet just like everybody else's. Jesus says, you need to wash one another's feet as well. So, I remember one time being awarded a most humble button, and then when I wore it, they took it away from me because it's an old joke, but anyway, as Forrest Gump said, that's all I have to say about that. Oh, good. Somebody from Walpole, Massachusetts is calling me. It's probably very important. Okay, what was that paper called? Thank you.